We used Catherine's college fund as collateral for Derek's restaurant. My mother-in-law announced casually over Sunday dinner, as if she had just mentioned the weather. What she didn't know was that the Educational Excellence Trust Fund she had just liquidated carried federal oversight requirements that would make her decision a federal crime punishable by up to 15 years in prison. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rebecca Sterling, and I am 34 years old. Until that devastating Sunday evening in March, I believed that the most challenging aspect of my life was balancing my career as a compliance attorney with raising my brilliant 15-year-old daughter Catherine, while maintaining a marriage to my husband Michael, whose family had always treated me as an outsider despite 12 years of trying to earn their acceptance. The Educational Excellence Trust Fund that my mother-in-law had so casually mentioned liquidating represented 7 years of meticulous financial planning, legal structuring, and personal sacrifice. I had established this fund when Catherine was 8 years old, utilizing my expertise in regulatory compliance to create a sophisticated financial instrument that would not only provide for her education, but also offer significant tax advantages and legal protections under federal education funding statutes. The fund had been structured through the Department of Education's Advanced Educational Investment Program, a specialized initiative designed to encourage long-term educational planning through tax-advantaged savings vehicles that carried strict regulatory oversight. The program required detailed documentation, regular reporting, and adherence to specific federal guidelines that governed how funds could be accessed, transferred, or utilized. Most importantly, the program included severe penalties for unauthorized access or misappropriation of funds, penalties that extended beyond simple financial restitution to include criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Catherine had been the sole beneficiary of this fund since its inception. Every deposit, every investment decision, every administrative action had been carefully documented and reported to federal authorities as required by the program's oversight mechanisms. The fund's current value exceeded $140,000, representing not only my direct contributions, but also matching grants from the federal program, tax-advantaged growth, and performance bonuses that rewarded consistent long-term participation in the Educational Investment Initiative. My expertise in regulatory compliance had made me acutely aware of the legal implications surrounding educational trust funds and the severe consequences that accompanied any unauthorized access or misuse of these federally monitored accounts. The Advanced Educational Investment Program operated under joint oversight from the Department of Education, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, creating multiple layers of legal protection that were designed to prevent exactly the type of misappropriation that my in-laws had just committed. The restaurant venture that had motivated this catastrophic decision belonged to Derek Mitchell, my sister-in-law Jennifer's husband, whose entrepreneurial ambitions had consistently exceeded his business acumen throughout the 8 years I had known him. Derek's previous ventures had included a failed food truck operation, an unsuccessful catering company, and a short-lived attempt at operating a specialty coffee shop that had closed within 6 months due to poor financial management and lack of customer demand. Despite this track record of business failures, Derek had convinced Michael's parents, Harold and Margaret Sterling, to support his latest restaurant concept by providing financial backing that he claimed would guarantee success. His restaurant proposal involved opening an upscale steakhouse in downtown Portland, Oregon, a market that was already saturated with similar establishments, and where Derek had no relevant experience or established relationships with suppliers, staff, or potential customers. The decision to liquidate Catherine's educational fund had been made without consulting me, despite the fact that I was both the fund's administrator and a licensed attorney with specific expertise in the regulatory framework governing such financial instruments. Harold and Margaret had apparently assumed that their status as Catherine's grandparents and Michael's parents gave them authority to make decisions about educational funds that had been established and maintained entirely through my professional expertise and financial contributions. This assumption revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of both the legal structure of the fund and the federal regulations that governed its operation. The Educational Excellence Trust Fund was not a simple savings account that could be accessed through family relationships or personal preferences, It was a federally regulated financial instrument with specific legal protections, reporting requirements, and severe penalties for unauthorized access that extended far beyond the immediate family dynamics that Harold and Margaret seemed to believe governed its operation. The casual manner in which Margaret had announced this decision during our regular Sunday dinner at their suburban Portland home demonstrated a level of disregard for both legal boundaries and family relationships that left me speechless with shock and anger. She had presented the liquidation as a generous family gesture that would help Derek achieve his entrepreneurial dreams while providing Catherine with alternative educational opportunities that could be arranged when she reached college age. Harold had supported this narrative by explaining that Derek's restaurant would provide employment opportunities for family members and generate income that could eventually replace the liquidated educational fund through more flexible arrangements that would not be subject to government oversight or regulatory restrictions. Their perspective revealed a complete lack of understanding regarding the value of federal tax advantages, matching grants, and legal protections that had made the Educational Excellence Trust Fund far more valuable than a simple savings account containing equivalent funds. Michael's response to his parents' announcement had been disappointingly predictable. Rather than expressing outrage at the unauthorized liquidation of his daughter's educational fund, he had focused on maintaining family harmony by suggesting that we could work together to find alternative solutions for Catherine's future educational expenses. His reaction demonstrated the same pattern of prioritizing his parents' preferences over our immediate family's interests that had characterized many of our previous disagreements about financial decisions and family boundaries. Catherine's reaction to learning about the liquidation of her educational fund had been devastating to witness. She had been aware of the fund's existence and had understood that it represented security for her academic future and the foundation for pursuing her dreams of studying environmental engineering at a prestigious university. Her academic performance had been exceptional throughout her educational career, with consistent placement in advanced programs, recognition for scientific research projects, and standardized test scores that positioned her as a strong candidate for competitive university programs. The loss of her educational fund represented more than financial impact. It represented a betrayal of trust, a violation of promises that had been made about her future, and a demonstration that her academic achievements and dreams were considered less important than Derek's latest business venture. Catherine's tears and confusion as she processed this information strengthened my resolve to address this situation through every legal means available. As I sat at the dinner table listening to Margaret and Harold justify their decision while Michael attempted to mediate between family members, I began formulating a response strategy that would utilize my professional expertise in regulatory compliance to ensure that appropriate consequences would follow their actions. They had assumed that family relationships would insulate them from legal repercussions, but they had severely underestimated both my knowledge of federal regulations and my commitment to protecting Catherine's interests. The Educational Excellence Trust Fund had been structured with multiple layers of legal protection, specifically to prevent unauthorized access and misappropriation. Every transaction was monitored by federal agencies. Every withdrawal required specific documentation and authorization, and every violation carried severe penalties that were designed to deter exactly the type of behavior that Harold and Margaret had just committed. Their decision to liquidate Catherine's educational fund without authorization represented multiple federal violations, including fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit theft of federally protected funds. The fact that they had used these funds as collateral for Derek's business loan added additional charges related to money laundering and fraudulent representation to financial institutions. The penalties for these violations included substantial financial restitution, criminal prosecution, and potential imprisonment that could affect multiple family members who had participated in or benefited from the unauthorized transactions. As dinner concluded and family members began discussing Derek's restaurant plans with enthusiasm, I excused myself to begin documenting the conversation and initiating the legal response that would ensure justice for Catherine and appropriate consequences for those who had betrayed our trust. They had made their decision based on assumptions about family relationships and legal authorities that were fundamentally incorrect. Now they would learn about the real consequences of violating federal regulations that governed educational trust funds. The drive home from Harold and Margaret's house was conducted in tense silence as Michael attempted to convince me that his parents' actions had been motivated by good intentions and that we should focus on finding solutions rather than creating family conflict. His perspective demonstrated the same enabling behavior that had allowed his parents to believe they could make unauthorized decisions about Catherine's educational fund without facing consequences. That evening, as Catherine completed her homework while struggling to process the loss of her educational security, I began the methodical process of documenting every aspect of the fund's liquidation and preparing the legal response that would restore justice and ensure that such violations would never occur again. They had underestimated both my professional capabilities and my determination to protect my daughter's future. Their assumption about family authority over federally regulated funds would prove to be the most expensive mistake they had ever made. The Educational Excellence Trust Fund had been more than a financial instrument. It had been a promise to Catherine that her academic excellence would be rewarded, her dreams would be supported, and her future would be protected through careful planning and legal safeguards. Harold and Margaret's decision to liquidate this fund had violated that promise, but their actions had also triggered federal oversight mechanisms that would ensure justice through channels that extended far beyond family dynamics and personal relationships. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt a sense of grim satisfaction knowing that my expertise in regulatory compliance would soon transform their casual violation of federal law into consequences that would serve as permanent reminders of the importance of respecting legal boundaries and family commitments. They had chosen to prioritize Derek's unproven business venture over Catherine's educational future. Tomorrow, I would begin ensuring they understood the full cost of that decision. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The morning after the devastating revelation at Sunday dinner, I arrived at my office 2 hours earlier than usual, armed with a methodical plan to systematically document every aspect of the unauthorized liquidation and build an irrefutable case for federal prosecution. My expertise in regulatory compliance had taught me that successful legal action required comprehensive evidence, detailed documentation, and strategic understanding of applicable statutes and enforcement mechanisms. The first priority was obtaining complete records of all transactions related to Catherine's Educational Excellence Trust Fund. As the fund's administrator and primary contributor, I possessed legal authority to access detailed transaction histories, regulatory filings, and compliance documentation that would establish the timeline and scope of the unauthorized liquidation. These records would serve as the foundation for demonstrating both the value of the misappropriated funds and the severity of the violations committed by Harold and Margaret. The Advanced Educational Investment Program maintained sophisticated tracking systems that monitored every transaction, documented all authorized users, and recorded detailed audit trails for compliance purposes. Accessing these systems revealed the shocking scope of the unauthorized liquidation that had occurred 3 weeks earlier, during a period when I had been traveling for a client consultation and had no knowledge of the pending transactions. The transaction records indicated that Harold Sterling had presented himself as Catherine's legal guardian at the Pacific Northwest Federal Credit Union, where the fund's primary account was maintained. He had submitted forged documentation claiming emergency authorization for educational expenses and had successfully convinced bank personnel to process a complete liquidation of the account, despite the federal oversight requirements that should have prevented such unauthorized access. The forged documentation included falsified letters claiming my authorization for the transaction, counterfeit copies of legal guardianship papers that had never been executed, and fraudulent emergency declarations that justified bypassing standard verification procedures. Each of these documents represented separate federal violations related to fraud, forgery, and misrepresentation to financial institutions operating under federal regulatory oversight. More significantly, the transaction records revealed that the liquidated funds had been immediately transferred to Derek's business account at a different financial institution, creating a clear paper trail that connected the theft of Catherine's educational funds to the collateral requirements for his restaurant loan application. This direct connection established criminal conspiracy charges and demonstrated premeditated coordination between multiple parties to commit federal crimes. The Advanced Educational Investment Program's compliance monitoring systems had already flagged the unauthorized liquidation as a potential violation requiring investigation. Federal oversight agencies had initiated preliminary inquiries into the transaction, and my status as the fund's administrator meant that I would soon receive formal notification requiring explanation of the circumstances surrounding the liquidation and documentation of authorization for the transaction. This federal attention provided an opportunity to escalate the matter beyond local law enforcement to agencies with specialized expertise in educational fraud and financial crimes. The Department of Education's Office of Inspector General maintained dedicated units focused on investigating violations of educational funding programs, while the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network possessed sophisticated tools for tracking money laundering and fraudulent transactions across multiple financial institutions. My analysis of applicable federal statutes revealed that Harold and Margaret's actions had violated multiple sections of the United States Code, including provisions related to theft of federal funds, conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and identity theft. The penalties for these violations included substantial financial restitution, criminal prosecution, and potential imprisonment ranging from 5 to 20 years depending on the specific charges and total value of the misappropriated funds. The Educational Excellence Trust Fund had been structured to include federal matching grants that effectively doubled the value of personal contributions under specific conditions. These matching grants represented taxpayer funds that were administered through the Department of Education and subject to enhanced penalties for misappropriation. The unauthorized liquidation had not only stolen Catherine's educational savings, but had also misappropriated federal grants that carried additional criminal liability for theft of government property. Beyond the immediate criminal violations, the unauthorized liquidation had triggered automatic penalties and tax consequences that would significantly increase the financial liability associated with Harold and Margaret's actions. The Advanced Educational Investment Program included substantial penalties for early withdrawal or unauthorized access, while the tax advantages associated with the fund would be reversed through additional assessments and interest charges. The documentation process also revealed the broader pattern of financial irresponsibility and questionable decision-making that had characterized Derek's previous business ventures. His loan application for the restaurant had included falsified revenue projections, exaggerated experience claims, and misleading information about available collateral that constituted fraud in its own right. The bank's decision to approve the loan based on the misappropriated educational funds meant that multiple financial institutions had been victimized through this coordinated criminal conspiracy. As I compiled evidence and prepared formal complaints to federal agencies, I also began developing a comprehensive understanding of the personal and professional consequences that would follow criminal prosecution of family members. While the emotional impact of these consequences was significant, my primary responsibility was protecting Catherine's interests and ensuring that appropriate justice was achieved for the violation of her educational security. The strategic documentation process extended beyond simply gathering evidence for criminal prosecution. I recognized that comprehensive civil litigation would be necessary to ensure full financial recovery, including compensation for lost federal benefits, tax advantages, and future earnings potential that had been compromised by the unauthorized liquidation. These civil remedies would provide additional mechanisms for achieving justice, while ensuring that Catherine's educational objectives could still be accomplished despite the theft of her original fund. My investigation also revealed that Michael had possessed knowledge of his parents' intentions to liquidate Catherine's educational fund, but had failed to inform me or attempt to prevent the unauthorized transaction. His complicity in concealing this planned violation added complexity to the family dynamics, while establishing additional legal liability for conspiracy and aiding the commission of federal crimes. The evidence indicated that family discussions about Derek's funding requirements had occurred over several weeks, during which multiple family members had been aware of the intention to use Catherine's educational fund as collateral for the restaurant loan. These discussions had included specific planning about how to access the fund without my knowledge and how to present the liquidation as a temporary arrangement that could be reversed once Derek's restaurant became profitable. This premeditation transformed what might have been characterized as a family misunderstanding into a coordinated criminal conspiracy involving multiple participants who had deliberately planned to violate federal regulations and steal funds designated for Catherine's education. The evidence of planning and coordination would strengthen criminal prosecution while providing additional grounds for enhanced penalties under federal sentencing guidelines. The documentation process also included analysis of Derek's restaurant business plan and financial projections to demonstrate the speculative nature of the investment for which Catherine's educational security had been sacrificed. The business plan revealed unrealistic revenue assumptions, inadequate market research, and fundamental misunderstanding of the competitive landscape in Portland's restaurant industry. Independent analysis of comparable restaurants in Derek's target market indicated that his revenue projections exceeded industry benchmarks by more than 300%, while his cost estimates were significantly below realistic levels for the type of establishment he proposed to operate. These discrepancies suggested that the business plan had been deliberately misleading to secure funding approval, adding additional fraud charges to the criminal conspiracy. The restaurant industry analysis also revealed that Derek's chosen location had been occupied by 3 failed restaurants over the previous 5 years, indicating structural challenges related to foot traffic, parking availability, and local competition that had not been adequately addressed in his business planning. This pattern of previous failures suggested that Catherine's educational fund had been sacrificed for a venture with minimal probability of success. As the documentation process continued, I began preparing formal complaints to multiple federal agencies with jurisdiction over different aspects of the criminal conspiracy. The Department of Education's Office of Inspector General would investigate violations related to educational funding programs, while the Federal Bureau of Investigation would coordinate broader aspects of the financial fraud and money laundering charges. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network would analyze the movement of funds between different institutions and accounts to establish the complete scope of the money laundering operation, while the Internal Revenue Service would investigate tax fraud related to the unauthorized liquidation and false documentation submitted to financial institutions. Each of these agencies possessed specialized expertise and enforcement capabilities that would ensure comprehensive investigation and prosecution of all aspects of the criminal conspiracy. The coordination between multiple federal agencies would also prevent any single aspect of the case from being overlooked or inadequately addressed through limited jurisdiction or resources. The strategic documentation process had revealed that Harold and Margaret's casual decision to liquidate Catherine's educational fund represented far more than a family disagreement about financial priorities. Their actions constituted a sophisticated criminal conspiracy involving fraud, theft, money laundering, and conspiracy that would result in severe consequences extending far beyond simple financial restitution. As I completed the initial documentation phase and prepared to initiate formal legal proceedings, I reflected on the ironic justice that my professional expertise in regulatory compliance would ensure that their violation of federal law would be addressed through the full scope of available legal remedies. They had assumed that family relationships would protect them from consequences, but they had chosen to violate regulations designed to protect educational investments with some of the most severe penalties in federal criminal law. The comprehensive documentation had established an irrefutable foundation for criminal prosecution, while providing the evidence necessary for complete civil recovery of Catherine's educational fund. Their decision to steal her educational security would ultimately result in consequences that would serve as permanent reminders of the importance of respecting legal boundaries and family commitments. The following Monday morning marked the beginning of a systematic legal campaign that would transform my family's casual betrayal into a federal criminal investigation involving multiple agencies and severe consequences that extended far beyond their comprehension. Armed with comprehensive documentation and strategic understanding of regulatory enforcement mechanisms, I initiated contact with federal agencies whose specialized expertise would ensure thorough investigation and appropriate prosecution of the crimes committed against Catherine's educational future. My first call was placed to the Department of Education's Office of Inspector General, which maintained dedicated fraud investigation units specifically designed to address violations of federal educational funding programs. The Advanced Educational Investment Program fell under direct oversight of this agency, and unauthorized liquidation of regulated educational accounts represented exactly the type of violation that triggered immediate investigative response and criminal referral to federal prosecutors. Special Agent Patricia Valdez answered my call with the professional efficiency that characterized federal investigators trained in complex financial crimes. Her initial questions focused on establishing my identity as the fund administrator, verifying my legal authority to report violations, and confirming the basic facts surrounding the unauthorized liquidation. The conversation revealed that federal oversight systems had already flagged the transaction as suspicious, and that preliminary investigation had begun based on automated compliance monitoring alerts. Agent Valdez explained that the Educational Excellence Trust Fund program incorporated sophisticated fraud detection mechanisms designed to identify unauthorized access attempts, suspicious transaction patterns, and potential violations of federal regulations governing educational savings accounts. The system had automatically generated alerts when Harold presented falsified documentation at the credit union, when the complete liquidation occurred without proper authorization channels, and when funds were immediately transferred to external accounts unrelated to educational expenses. These automated alerts had initiated preliminary investigation procedures that included review of transaction records, analysis of submitted documentation, and coordination with other federal agencies that maintained oversight responsibilities for different aspects of educational funding programs. My formal complaint would accelerate this investigation while providing additional evidence and context that would strengthen criminal prosecution efforts. The conversation with Agent Valdez also revealed the broader scope of federal interest in violations of educational funding programs. The Department of Education had identified educational fraud as a growing problem that undermined public confidence in federal assistance programs, while diverting taxpayer resources from legitimate educational objectives. Prosecution of high-profile cases served both justice and deterrence purposes by demonstrating serious consequences for those who attempted to exploit educational funding systems. Agent Valdez scheduled a formal interview for the following day, during which I would provide detailed testimony about the circumstances surrounding the unauthorized liquidation, submit comprehensive documentation supporting the criminal complaint, and review evidence that federal investigators had already gathered through their preliminary investigation. This interview would establish the foundation for criminal prosecution, while initiating coordination with other agencies that possessed jurisdiction over different aspects of the conspiracy. My second contact was with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, the federal agency responsible for investigating money laundering and fraudulent financial transactions that crossed institutional boundaries. The transfer of Catherine's educational funds to Derek's business account represented exactly the type of suspicious financial activity that fell under FinCEN's enforcement jurisdiction, particularly when combined with the fraudulent documentation used to authorize the original liquidation. Financial intelligence analyst Marcus Chen reviewed the basic facts of the case during our initial conversation and confirmed that the transaction pattern met established criteria for money laundering investigation. The movement of funds from a federally regulated educational account to a commercial business account through fraudulent authorization constituted suspicious financial activity that warranted comprehensive analysis and potential criminal referral. Analyst Chen explained that FinCEN maintains sophisticated tracking capabilities that could trace financial transactions across multiple institutions, identify patterns of suspicious activity, and coordinate with other federal agencies to build comprehensive cases against complex financial conspiracies. The agency's resources would be particularly valuable for establishing the complete scope of the money laundering operation and identifying any additional victims or transactions that might be connected to Derek's funding activities. The FinCEN investigation would also examine Derek's previous business ventures and financial activities to determine whether the current conspiracy represented an isolated incident or part of a broader pattern of fraudulent business practices. This analysis could reveal additional crimes while strengthening criminal prosecution through evidence of ongoing criminal enterprise rather than isolated criminal acts. My third contact was with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Unit, which specialized in complex financial fraud cases involving multiple defendants and interstate criminal activity. The conspiracy to liquidate Catherine's educational fund involved coordination between residents of different states, utilization of interstate banking systems, and violation of federal regulations that fell clearly within FBI jurisdiction. Special Agent Jennifer Rodriguez explained that the FBI's white-collar crime units maintained specialized expertise in investigating educational fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy cases that involved sophisticated planning and coordination between multiple defendants. The evidence I had compiled would be integrated with broader FBI databases that tracked similar criminal activities and identified potential connections to other ongoing investigations. Agent Rodriguez emphasized that federal prosecution of financial crimes involving educational funding carried enhanced penalties designed to protect vulnerable populations and maintain public confidence in federal assistance programs. The conspiracy involving Catherine's educational fund represented multiple federal crimes that could result in significant prison sentences, substantial financial penalties, and long-term consequences for professional licensing and employment opportunities. The FBI investigation would coordinate with local law enforcement agencies to ensure that all aspects of the criminal conspiracy were thoroughly investigated, while federal prosecutors would determine appropriate charges based on the complete scope of criminal activity and the defendant's previous criminal history. This coordination would ensure comprehensive prosecution while avoiding jurisdictional conflicts that might compromise successful prosecution efforts. During these initial conversations with federal investigators, I also provided preliminary information about Michael's knowledge of his parents' intentions and his failure to prevent or report the planned liquidation. This information established additional criminal liability for conspiracy and aiding federal crimes, while complicating family dynamics in ways that would have lasting consequences for our marriage and extended family relationships. The federal investigators expressed particular interest in the premeditated nature of the conspiracy and the sophisticated planning that had been necessary to execute the unauthorized liquidation. The evidence of family meetings, coordinated planning, and deliberate attempts to conceal the transaction from my knowledge demonstrated criminal intent that would strengthen prosecution efforts while supporting enhanced penalties under federal sentencing guidelines. The investigation initiation process also included contact with the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division, which maintained jurisdiction over tax fraud related to educational savings accounts and false documentation submitted to financial institutions. The unauthorized liquidation had triggered automatic tax penalties and assessments that constituted additional criminal liability, while the falsified documentation represented tax fraud that carried separate federal charges. IRS criminal investigator David Park explained that violations of educational savings account regulations often involve complex tax fraud schemes designed to avoid legitimate tax consequences associated with early withdrawal or unauthorized access. The investigation would examine whether Harold and Margaret had attempted to conceal the tax implications of their actions while determining appropriate criminal charges related to tax evasion and fraudulent documentation. The IRS investigation would also analyze Derek's business tax filings to determine whether his loan application had included false information about income, assets, or business prospects that constituted tax fraud independent of the educational fund conspiracy. This analysis could reveal additional criminal charges while establishing patterns of fraudulent behavior that would strengthen overall prosecution efforts. Throughout the investigation initiation process, I maintained detailed records of all conversations with federal investigators, documented all evidence submissions, and tracked the progression of different agency investigations to ensure comprehensive coordination and avoid any gaps in prosecution efforts. This systematic approach reflected my professional training in regulatory compliance while ensuring that justice would be achieved through all available legal mechanisms. The federal investigators uniformly expressed confidence that the evidence supported strong criminal cases against multiple defendants, while the coordination between different agencies would ensure comprehensive prosecution that addressed all aspects of the criminal conspiracy. The seriousness of their response validated my decision to pursue federal prosecution rather than attempting to resolve the matter through family negotiations or civil litigation alone. As the federal investigation gained momentum, I began receiving updates about preliminary findings that confirmed the scope and severity of the crimes committed against Catherine's educational future. The investigators had identified additional evidence of planning and coordination that strengthened criminal cases, while forensic analysis of financial records revealed attempts to conceal the true purpose of the fund liquidation through misleading documentation and false representations. The investigation also revealed that Pacific Northwest Federal Credit Union had failed to follow proper verification procedures when processing Harold's liquidation request, creating institutional liability for negligent facilitation of financial crimes. This institutional failure would provide additional avenues for civil recovery while ensuring that proper procedures would be implemented to prevent similar violations in the future. The federal investigation had transformed what Harold and Margaret had assumed would be a simple family financial arrangement into a complex criminal case involving multiple agencies, sophisticated investigative techniques, and serious federal charges that would result in substantial consequences for all participants in the conspiracy. Their casual decision to liquidate Catherine's educational fund had triggered law enforcement responses that extended far beyond their comprehension or preparation. As I concluded the investigation initiation phase and prepared for formal interviews with federal investigators, I reflected on the powerful validation that came from professional recognition of the seriousness of the crimes committed against my daughter. The federal investigators had immediately understood the significance of the violations and had committed substantial resources to ensuring comprehensive prosecution and justice. The investigation initiation had established foundation for criminal prosecution that would ensure appropriate consequences for the theft of Catherine's educational future, while demonstrating to other potential violators that federal educational funding programs were protected by sophisticated enforcement mechanisms and serious criminal penalties. The systematic approach to seeking justice would serve both Catherine's immediate interests and broader public objectives related to protecting educational investments and maintaining confidence in federal assistance programs. The formal interview with Special Agent Patricia Valdez took place in the sterile conference room of the Department of Education's regional office, where fluorescent lighting cast sharp shadows across polished tables that had witnessed countless investigations into educational fraud and financial crimes. I arrived with meticulously organized documentation spanning 7 years of fund administration, prepared to provide testimony that would establish the foundation for comprehensive federal prosecution of the conspiracy that had stolen Catherine's educational future. Agent Valdez began the session by reviewing my credentials and establishing my expertise in regulatory compliance, which provided essential context for understanding both the sophisticated structure of Catherine's educational fund and the magnitude of the violations committed by my in-laws. My professional background in compliance law meant that I possessed intimate knowledge of federal regulations governing educational savings programs, making me uniquely qualified to explain the legal implications of unauthorized fund liquidation to investigators who specialized in financial crimes. The interview proceeded systematically through every aspect of the Educational Excellence Trust Fund, from its initial establishment through the unauthorized liquidation that had triggered federal investigation. Agent Valdez demonstrated impressive understanding of the regulatory framework governing educational savings programs, asking detailed questions about federal oversight mechanisms, compliance requirements, and enforcement procedures that govern fund administration and beneficiary protection. My testimony established that the fund had been structured with multiple layers of legal protection specifically designed to prevent unauthorized access and ensure that educational investments would be preserved for their intended purposes. The Advanced Educational Investment Program required detailed documentation of all transactions, mandatory reporting to federal oversight agencies, and strict verification procedures for any withdrawals or account modifications that affected beneficiary rights or fund integrity. Agent Valdez explained that federal investigators had already obtained comprehensive financial records from Pacific Northwest Federal Credit Union, revealing the extent of fraudulent documentation that Herald had submitted to authorize the liquidation. The bank's records included copies of forged letters claiming emergency authorization, falsified guardianship documents, and counterfeit identification materials that had been used to circumvent standard verification procedures designed to protect educational savings accounts. The investigation had also revealed that Herald had made multiple visits to the credit union over a 2-week period, gradually building relationships with bank personnel and establishing credibility through false representations about his authority over Catherine's educational fund. This pattern of behavior demonstrated premeditation and sophisticated planning that elevated the crimes from simple theft to complex fraud involving identity theft, forgery, and conspiracy to commit federal crimes. Forensic analysis of the submitted documentation had confirmed that multiple federal crimes had been committed during the liquidation process. The forged authorization letters constituted mail fraud and wire fraud when transmitted electronically between financial institutions, while the falsified guardianship documents represented identity theft and fraudulent impersonation of legal authority. Each of these violations carried substantial penalties under federal criminal statutes, with potential sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years in federal prison. Agent Valdez also revealed that the investigation had expanded beyond the immediate conspiracy involving Harold and Margaret to include examination of Derek's business activities and loan application procedures. The restaurant loan that had motivated the educational fund liquidation had been obtained through false representations about available collateral, projected revenues, and business experience that constituted additional fraud charges against multiple defendants. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had initiated parallel investigation of Derek's previous business ventures, revealing a pattern of fraudulent loan applications, misrepresented financial statements, and deliberately misleading business plans that had resulted in substantial losses for multiple financial institutions. This pattern established Derek as a career fraudster, whose current restaurant venture represented continuation of ongoing criminal enterprise rather than isolated business failure. Financial Crimes Enforcement Network analysis had traced the movement of Catherine's educational funds through multiple accounts and transactions designed to obscure the connection between the unauthorized liquidation and Derek's business loan. This money laundering operation involved coordination between multiple financial institutions and deliberate attempts to conceal the source of funds through complex transfer mechanisms that violated federal banking regulations. The FinCEN investigation had also identified additional victims of Derek's fraudulent business practices, including elderly investors who had provided funding for previous ventures based on false representations about business prospects and financial returns. These additional victims strengthened federal prosecution efforts, while demonstrating the broader scope of criminal activity that had culminated in the theft of Catherine's educational fund. During the interview, Agent Valdez presented evidence that Michael had possessed detailed knowledge of his parents, plans to liquidate Catherine's educational fund, and had actively participated in planning meetings where the conspiracy was discussed and coordinated. Phone records and electronic communications revealed that Michael had been involved in research about fund liquidation procedures and had provided information about my travel schedule that enabled the conspirators to execute their plan while I was unavailable to prevent the unauthorized transaction. This evidence established Michael as a co-conspirator, rather than simply a family member who had failed to prevent criminal activity. His active participation in planning and coordination meant that he faced substantial criminal liability for conspiracy, aiding federal crimes, and potentially racketeering charges if the investigation revealed broader patterns of coordinated criminal activity among family members. The revelation of Michael's active participation in the conspiracy represented a profound betrayal that extended beyond the theft of Catherine's educational fund to encompass violation of marital trust and parental responsibility. His willingness to conspire against his own daughter's educational future for the benefit of his sister's husband demonstrated character deficiencies that would have lasting consequences for our marriage and family relationships. Agent Valdez explained that federal prosecutors were considering charges under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, which provided enhanced penalties for ongoing criminal enterprises involving multiple defendants and coordinated criminal activities. The evidence of planning, coordination, and systematic fraud involving multiple family members met the statutory requirements for RICO prosecution, which could result in substantial additional penalties and asset forfeiture that would ensure comprehensive financial recovery. The interview also addressed the institutional failures at Pacific Northwest Federal Credit Union that had enabled the unauthorized liquidation despite federal regulations requiring strict verification procedures for educational savings accounts. The bank's negligent processing of Harold's fraudulent documentation had facilitated federal crimes while violating regulatory requirements that governed financial institutions operating under federal oversight. Federal investigators had initiated separate investigation of the credit union's compliance procedures and employee training programs to determine whether institutional reforms would be necessary to prevent similar violations in the future. This investigation could result in substantial fines, regulatory sanctions, and mandated compliance improvements that would strengthen protection for educational savings accounts throughout the federal banking system. The Department of Education had also initiated review of the Advanced Educational Investment Program's fraud detection and prevention mechanisms to identify potential improvements that could enhance protection for educational savings accounts. Catherine's case had revealed vulnerabilities in the system that could be exploited by sophisticated fraudsters, and program modifications would ensure that similar violations would be detected and prevented more effectively in the future. As the formal interview concluded, Agent Valdez confirmed that federal prosecutors had reviewed the evidence and authorized comprehensive criminal charges against all participants in the conspiracy. The charges included mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, conspiracy to commit federal crimes, and potentially racketeering violations that carried substantial prison sentences and financial penalties designed to ensure complete restitution and deterrence of similar criminal activity. The timing of criminal prosecution would be coordinated with civil litigation efforts to ensure that Catherine's educational fund would be fully restored, while criminal penalties would provide appropriate punishment for the violations committed against her educational future. Federal prosecutors had expressed confidence that the evidence supported strong cases against all defendants, while the coordination between multiple federal agencies would ensure comprehensive prosecution of all aspects of the criminal conspiracy. Agent Valdez also explained that federal witness protection resources would be available if threats or intimidation occurred during the prosecution process, recognizing that family-based criminal conspiracies often involved attempts to pressure victims into withdrawing cooperation or providing false testimony to protect criminal defendants. My safety and Catherine's security would be monitored throughout the prosecution process to ensure that justice could be achieved without compromising our personal safety. The interview process had validated my decision to pursue federal prosecution rather than attempting to resolve the matter through family negotiations or civil litigation alone. The systematic investigation had revealed the true scope of criminal activity while establishing foundation for comprehensive prosecution that would ensure appropriate consequences for all participants in the conspiracy that had stolen Catherine's educational future. Federal investigators had demonstrated impressive expertise and commitment to achieving justice through thorough investigation and coordinated prosecution efforts. Their professional approach had transformed a devastating family betrayal into a criminal case that would serve both Catherine's immediate interests and broader public objectives related to protecting educational investments and maintaining confidence in federal assistance programs. As I left the federal office building and prepared for the next phase of legal proceedings, I felt profound satisfaction knowing that my expertise in regulatory compliance had enabled effective collaboration with federal investigators, whose specialized capabilities would ensure comprehensive prosecution and justice. The systematic approach to seeking accountability had established foundation for criminal consequences that would serve as permanent reminders of the importance of respecting legal boundaries and family commitments. The unsealing of federal criminal indictments occurred precisely 2 weeks after my formal interview with federal investigators, marking the transition from investigation to prosecution and initiating a cascade of consequences that would fundamentally alter the lives of every person involved in the conspiracy to steal Catherine's educational future. The timing of the indictments had been carefully coordinated to ensure simultaneous arrests and prevent any opportunities for evidence, destruction, or flight by the defendants. Assistant United States Attorney Maria Santos had prepared comprehensive criminal charges that reflected the full scope of criminal activity uncovered during the federal investigation. The indictments included 47 separate counts against 4 defendants, with charges ranging from mail fraud and wire fraud to money laundering, identity theft, conspiracy to commit federal crimes, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act that carried enhanced penalties for ongoing criminal enterprise. Harold Sterling faced 18 federal charges related to his central role in executing the unauthorized liquidation of Catherine's educational fund. The charges included multiple counts of mail fraud for submitting falsified documentation to financial institutions, wire fraud for electronic transmission of fraudulent authorization materials, identity theft for impersonating legal authority over Catherine's educational account, and money laundering for facilitating the transfer of stolen funds to Derek's business ventures. Margaret Sterling faced 12 federal charges related to her participation in planning the conspiracy and providing assistance in executing the unauthorized liquidation. The charges included conspiracy to commit federal crimes, aiding and abetting mail fraud, and money laundering conspiracy for her role in coordinating the transfer of stolen educational funds to support Derek's restaurant loan application. Michael Sterling faced 8 federal charges that reflected his active participation in planning and coordinating the conspiracy against his own daughter's educational future. The charges included conspiracy to commit federal crimes, aiding and abetting wire fraud, and obstruction of justice for his efforts to conceal the conspiracy during the initial stages of federal investigation. His betrayal of parental responsibility had been elevated to federal criminal charges that carried substantial prison sentences and professional consequences. Derek Mitchell faced 14 federal charges that encompassed both his role in the educational fund conspiracy and his broader pattern of fraudulent business practices that had been uncovered during the federal investigation. The charges included multiple counts of loan fraud, money laundering, conspiracy to commit federal crimes, and ongoing criminal enterprise violations under the RICO statute that recognized his systematic approach to defrauding financial institutions and investors. The federal arrests were conducted simultaneously at 6 different locations across Oregon and Washington, utilizing coordinated teams of federal agents who had been briefed on the specific circumstances surrounding each defendant's role in the conspiracy. The coordination ensured that evidence would be preserved while preventing any opportunities for communication between defendants that might compromise prosecution efforts. Harold and Margaret Sterling were arrested at their suburban Portland home during the early morning hours, when federal agents executed search warrants that authorized comprehensive collection of documents, electronic devices, and financial records related to the educational fund conspiracy. Neighbors witnessed the dramatic scene as federal agents systematically searched the property while placing the elderly couple in custody for transportation to federal detention facilities. The search of Harold and Margaret's residence revealed extensive documentation that confirmed the premeditated nature of the conspiracy and provided additional evidence of criminal planning that had extended over several months. Federal agents discovered handwritten notes outlining strategies for accessing Catherine's educational fund, printed research about federal regulations governing educational savings accounts, and correspondence, with Derek discussing the timing and coordination of the unauthorized liquidation. Michael Sterling was arrested at his workplace, where federal agents had coordinated with building security to ensure minimal disruption while maintaining the element of surprise necessary for effective evidence preservation. His arrest in the professional environment where he had built his career added public humiliation to the criminal charges and ensured that colleagues and clients would become aware of his participation in crimes against his own daughter's educational future. Derek Mitchell was arrested at the construction site where his restaurant was under development, creating a dramatic scene that would be witnessed by contractors, suppliers, and potential business partners who had been involved in the restaurant project. Federal agents also executed search warrants at the restaurant location and Derek's residence, collecting evidence that documented his broader pattern of fraudulent business practices and systematic deception of financial institutions. The federal detention hearings revealed the seriousness with which federal prosecutors and federal magistrates viewed the crimes committed against Catherine's educational future. Assistant United States Attorney Santos argued that all defendants represented flight risks due to the substantial prison sentences they faced, and the evidence of sophisticated planning that demonstrated their willingness to engage in complex criminal conspiracies. Harold Sterling was denied bail after federal prosecutors presented evidence that he had attempted to liquidate additional assets and had made inquiries about transferring property to relatives in Canada during the period between the federal investigation's initiation and the unsealing of criminal indictments. This evidence of flight preparation convinced the federal magistrate that Harold represented a substantial risk for fleeing the jurisdiction to avoid prosecution. Margaret Sterling was granted bail under restrictive conditions that included surrender of her passport, weekly reporting to federal probation authorities, and prohibition from accessing any financial accounts or making any transactions exceeding $500 without prior approval from federal authorities. The restrictive bail conditions reflected the court's recognition that her participation in the conspiracy had been voluntary and sophisticated, rather than simply following her husband's direction. Michael Sterling was denied bail after federal prosecutors presented evidence that he had attempted to conceal assets and had engaged in communications with other defendants that violated pretrial detention orders prohibiting contact between co-conspirators. His efforts to obstruct the federal investigation while maintaining the pretense of cooperation had convinced the federal magistrate that he could not be trusted to comply with bail conditions. Derek Mitchell was granted bail under extremely restrictive conditions that included electronic monitoring, surrender of all travel documents, and prohibition from engaging in any business activities without prior approval from federal probation authorities. The bail conditions effectively ended his restaurant project and prevented him from accessing the stolen educational funds that had been frozen pending criminal prosecution and civil recovery proceedings. The federal indictments had immediate consequences that extended beyond criminal prosecution to encompass professional licensing, employment relationships, and family dynamics that would be permanently altered by the revelation of criminal behavior. Harold's position as a senior insurance adjuster was terminated immediately upon notification of criminal charges, while Margaret's employment as a school district administrator ended when federal criminal charges became public knowledge. Michael's career as a commercial real estate broker faced immediate suspension pending resolution of criminal charges, as professional licensing authorities initiated disciplinary proceedings that would likely result in permanent revocation of his license, regardless of the outcome of criminal prosecution. His participation in crimes against his own daughter's educational future had created professional consequences that would prevent him from returning to his previous career, even if criminal charges were eventually resolved favorably. Derek's construction business collapsed immediately upon his arrest, as suppliers, contractors, and investors withdrew from all projects associated with his criminal enterprise. The restaurant project that had motivated the theft of Catherine's educational fund was abandoned, leaving a partially completed facility that would serve as a permanent monument to the consequences of criminal greed and family betrayal. The federal prosecution had also initiated asset forfeiture proceedings that would ensure complete recovery of Catherine's educational fund, while providing additional punishment for the defendants' criminal behavior. Federal authorities had frozen all assets connected to the conspiracy, including Harold and Margaret's residence, Michael's real estate investments, and Derek's business assets that had been purchased with proceeds from fraudulent activities. The civil litigation that I had initiated parallel to criminal prosecution was proceeding simultaneously, seeking damages that extended beyond simple restitution to include compensation for lost federal benefits, tax advantages, and future earnings potential that had been compromised by the theft of Catherine's educational security. The civil claims would ensure comprehensive financial recovery, while providing additional mechanisms for holding the defendants accountable for their criminal behavior. The Pacific Northwest Federal Credit Union had also been named as a defendant in civil litigation, facing claims related to negligent facilitation of financial crimes and violation of federal regulations governing educational savings accounts. The institution's failure to follow proper verification procedures had enabled the unauthorized liquidation, creating institutional liability that would provide additional resources for Catherine's educational recovery, while ensuring that proper procedures would be implemented to prevent similar violations. The media attention surrounding the federal prosecution had created additional consequences for the defendants, as local news organizations reported extensively on the family conspiracy that had stolen a teenager's educational future to support a fraudulent restaurant venture. The public attention had transformed private family dynamics into public scrutiny that would have lasting consequences for all family members involved in the criminal conspiracy. Catherine's response to the federal prosecution had been complex, reflecting both satisfaction that justice was being pursued and sadness about the destruction of family relationships that had resulted from criminal behavior by people she had trusted and loved. Her resilience and maturity in processing these difficult circumstances had strengthened my determination to ensure that comprehensive justice would be achieved, while her educational objectives would be fully supported despite the criminal conspiracy. The federal prosecution had validated my decision to pursue comprehensive legal remedies, rather than attempting to resolve the matter through family negotiations that would have provided inadequate justice and insufficient protection for Catherine's future educational security. The systematic approach to criminal accountability had established foundation for consequences that would serve both immediate justice objectives and broader deterrence purposes. As the criminal prosecution entered the pretrial phase, federal prosecutors had expressed confidence that the evidence supported strong convictions against all defendants, while the coordination between criminal and civil proceedings would ensure comprehensive recovery and appropriate punishment for the crimes committed against Catherine's educational future. The professional expertise that I had brought to seeking justice had created opportunities for collaboration with federal authorities, whose specialized capabilities would ensure that family betrayal would result in appropriate legal consequences. The federal courthouse in Portland became the center of intense legal activity, as pretrial proceedings commenced for the 4 defendants facing comprehensive criminal charges related to the conspiracy that had stolen Catherine's educational future. The complexity of the case required extensive coordination between defense attorneys, federal prosecutors, and federal magistrates who would oversee the proceedings that would determine whether plea negotiations could resolve the matter or whether comprehensive trials would be necessary to achieve justice. The appointment of defense counsel revealed the serious nature of the federal charges and the substantial resources that would be required to mount effective defense strategies against the comprehensive evidence that federal investigators had compiled. Harold Sterling retained Thomas Richardson, a veteran federal criminal defense attorney whose practice specialized in complex financial fraud cases and who possessed extensive experience defending clients against charges involving educational fraud and conspiracy to commit federal crimes. Margaret Sterling was represented by Sandra Phillips, a former federal prosecutor who had transitioned to defense practice and who brought insider knowledge of federal prosecution strategies and plea negotiation procedures that could prove valuable in minimizing her criminal exposure. Her experience prosecuting similar cases provided strategic advantages in understanding how federal prosecutors would approach the evidence and what concessions might be available through cooperative plea agreements. Michael Sterling's retention of criminal defense counsel proved particularly complex due to potential conflicts of interest related to his position as both a criminal defendant and my estranged spouse, whose interests might diverge from other family members involved in the conspiracy. His attorney, David Morrison, specialized in cases involving professional licensing consequences and white-collar crimes that affected career professionals whose criminal behavior had jeopardized their professional standing and future employment prospects. Derek Mitchell was represented by Jennifer Adams, an experienced federal criminal defense attorney whose practice focused on defending clients against RICO charges and complex conspiracy prosecutions involving multiple defendants and ongoing criminal enterprises. Her expertise would be essential for addressing the enhanced penalties associated with racketeering charges that could result in substantially longer prison sentences and more severe financial consequences. The pretrial discovery process revealed the extraordinary scope of evidence that federal investigators had compiled during their comprehensive investigation of the educational fund conspiracy and related criminal activities. Federal prosecutors had obtained over 12,000 pages of documentary evidence, including financial records, electronic communications, surveillance materials, and forensic analysis that established the timeline and coordination of criminal activities involving all four defendants. The discovery materials included detailed analysis of Derek's previous business ventures and fraudulent loan applications that demonstrated a pattern of criminal behavior extending over several years and involving multiple financial institutions. This evidence strengthened the RICO charges by establishing that the educational fund conspiracy represented continuation of ongoing criminal enterprise rather than isolated criminal acts committed by otherwise law-abiding family members. Federal prosecutors had also obtained comprehensive forensic analysis of electronic devices seized during the arrests, revealing extensive communications between defendants that documented their planning, coordination, and attempts to conceal their criminal activities from federal investigators. The electronic evidence included text messages, emails, and social media communications that provided contemporaneous documentation of criminal intent and coordination that would be extremely difficult for defense attorneys to challenge or explain. The pretrial motions filed by defense attorneys revealed their strategies for challenging different aspects of the federal prosecution while seeking to minimize their clients' criminal exposure through procedural challenges and evidentiary disputes. Harold Sterling's attorney filed motions challenging the validity of search warrants and seeking suppression of evidence obtained during the searches of his residence and financial records. Margaret Sterling's attorney focused on challenging her level of involvement in the conspiracy, arguing that her participation had been limited and that she had been influenced by her husband's criminal planning, rather than being an independent participant in the criminal enterprise. This strategy sought to position her as a minor participant who deserved reduced charges and minimal sentencing exposure compared to the primary organizers of the conspiracy. Michael Sterling's attorney pursued a strategy focused on challenging the characterization of his actions as criminal conspiracy, arguing that his knowledge of his parents' plans did not constitute active participation in criminal activities, and that his failure to prevent the unauthorized liquidation did not rise to the level of federal criminal charges. This defense strategy sought to distinguish between knowledge of criminal activity and active participation in criminal conspiracy. Derek Mitchell's attorney filed comprehensive motions challenging the RICO charges and arguing that his business activities, while unsuccessful, did not constitute the type of ongoing criminal enterprise that justified enhanced racketeering penalties. The defense strategy sought to characterize his actions as civil business disputes rather than criminal violations that warranted federal prosecution and substantial prison sentences. The federal prosecutors' responses to defense motions demonstrated their confidence in the strength of the evidence and their commitment to comprehensive prosecution of all defendants involved in the conspiracy. Assistant United States Attorney Maria Santos filed detailed responses that addressed each defense challenge, while presenting additional evidence that reinforced the criminal charges and demonstrated the sophisticated nature of the conspiracy. The prosecution's response to Harold Sterling's motion to suppress evidence included additional documentation of his attempts to conceal criminal activities and his efforts to destroy evidence during the period between the initiation of federal investigation and his arrest. This evidence of obstruction of justice strengthened the criminal charges while undermining defense arguments about the validity of search procedures and evidence collection. The response to Margaret Sterling's minimization strategy included evidence of her active participation in planning meetings and her coordination of communication between conspirators during the execution of the unauthorized liquidation. The evidence demonstrated that her involvement had been voluntary and sophisticated, rather than simply following her husband's direction, supporting the criminal charges and contradicting defense arguments about limited participation. The prosecution's response to Michael Sterling's defense strategy included evidence of his active research into fund liquidation procedures and his provision of information about my travel schedule that had been essential for timing the unauthorized transaction. This evidence established his role as an active conspirator, rather than simply a family member with knowledge of criminal activity, supporting the federal charges and justifying substantial criminal penalties. The response to Derek Mitchell's challenge to RICO charges included comprehensive documentation of his pattern of fraudulent business practices extending over several years and involving multiple victims and financial institutions. The evidence established that the educational fund conspiracy represented continuation of ongoing criminal enterprise that justified enhanced racketeering penalties and substantial prison sentences. The pretrial proceedings also included extensive discussions about potential plea agreements that could resolve the criminal charges without requiring comprehensive trials that would be costly and time-consuming for all parties involved. Federal prosecutors indicated willingness to consider plea negotiations that included substantial prison sentences, comprehensive financial restitution, and cooperation with ongoing investigations into related criminal activities. The plea negotiation process revealed significant tensions between defendants whose interests had begun to diverge as the reality of federal prosecution became apparent. Harold Sterling's attorney explored plea agreements that could minimize his prison exposure in exchange for cooperation and testimony against other defendants, particularly Derek Mitchell, whose business ventures had motivated the entire conspiracy. Margaret Sterling's attorney pursued plea negotiations focused on achieving supervised release rather than prison sentences, arguing that her age and limited criminal history justified minimal incarceration, despite her participation in the conspiracy. The prosecution's response indicated that some consideration might be given to reduce sentences in exchange for substantial cooperation and complete financial restitution. Michael Sterling's plea negotiations proved particularly complex due to his relationship with me and his potential value as a cooperating witness against other family members involved in the conspiracy. His attorney explored agreements that could minimize professional licensing consequences, while ensuring that his testimony would support prosecution of other defendants. Derek Mitchell's attorney faced the greatest challenges in plea negotiations due to the RICO charges and the evidence of ongoing criminal enterprise that justified enhanced penalties. The prosecution's position indicated that substantial prison sentences would be required for any plea agreement, while cooperation might influence the specific length of incarceration rather than eliminating imprisonment entirely. The pretrial detention reviews conducted for defendants who had been denied bail revealed additional evidence of their attempts to obstruct justice and conceal assets during the period following their arrest. Harold Sterling had attempted to transfer property to relatives and had engaged in communications with potential witnesses that violated pretrial detention orders, strengthening the prosecution's position and undermining defense arguments about his suitability for pretrial release. the mounting pressure of federal prosecution had begun to create visible stress and health consequences for all defendants, particularly Harold and Margaret Sterling, whose advanced age made prolonged pretrial detention and potential prison sentences especially burdensome. Their deteriorating physical condition added complexity to plea negotiations while reinforcing the serious consequences of their criminal behavior. The pretrial proceedings had also created significant financial pressure on all defendants, as legal fees for experienced federal criminal defense attorneys exceeded $100,000 per defendant, while their assets remained frozen pending resolution of criminal charges and civil litigation. The financial pressure added incentive for plea negotiations, while ensuring that the costs of defending against criminal charges would serve as additional punishment for their participation in the conspiracy. The comprehensive nature of federal prosecution had transformed what the defendants had assumed would be a simple family financial arrangement into a complex criminal case that threatened to destroy their lives, careers, and family relationships permanently. The mounting pressure of evidence, legal costs, and potential prison sentences had created circumstances that would ultimately force them to confront the full consequences of their decision to steal Catherine's educational future for the benefit of Derek's fraudulent business ventures. The pressure of mounting evidence and escalating legal costs reached a critical threshold 6 weeks into the pretrial proceedings, when Margaret Sterling became the first defendant to acknowledge the futility of continued resistance against comprehensive federal prosecution. Her decision to pursue serious plea negotiations marked the beginning of a cascade of confessions and cooperation agreements that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the criminal case while ensuring complete accountability for the conspiracy that had stolen Catherine's educational future. Margaret's attorney, Sandra Phillips, had conducted extensive analysis of the federal evidence and concluded that her client faced virtually certain conviction on all criminal charges if the matter proceeded to trial. The documentary evidence, electronic communications, and forensic analysis provided overwhelming proof of Margaret's active participation in planning and executing the unauthorized liquidation of Catherine's educational fund. The evidence established criminal intent, coordination with other conspirators, and deliberate attempts to conceal criminal activities that would be impossible to refute during trial proceedings. The plea negotiations between Margaret's attorney and federal prosecutors required careful consideration of her potential cooperation value against other defendants, particularly Harold Sterling and Derek Mitchell, whose leadership roles in the conspiracy made them primary targets for enhanced prosecution efforts. Margaret possessed detailed knowledge of planning meetings, coordination activities, and attempted concealment efforts that could provide crucial testimony for securing convictions against the remaining defendants. Assistant United States Attorney Maria Santos outlined the prosecution's position during formal plea negotiations conducted in the secure conference facilities of the federal courthouse. The government's offer included guilty pleas to conspiracy to commit federal crimes, mail fraud, and money laundering charges that would result in supervised release rather than imprisonment, contingent upon complete cooperation with ongoing prosecution efforts and comprehensive financial restitution to restore Catherine's educational fund. The cooperation agreement required Margaret to provide detailed testimony about all aspects of the conspiracy, including the timeline of planning activities, the specific roles played by each defendant, and the methods used to execute the unauthorized liquidation. Her testimony would be particularly valuable for establishing Harold's leadership role in the conspiracy and Derek's manipulation of family relationships to secure funding for his fraudulent business ventures. Margaret's decision to accept the plea agreement created immediate tension with other defendants whose defense strategies had been predicated on presenting a unified front against federal prosecution. Harold Sterling's attorney expressed concern that Margaret's cooperation would undermine his client's position while providing prosecutors with insider testimony that would be extremely difficult to challenge during cross-examination. The cooperation agreement also included provisions requiring Margaret to assist federal investigators in recovering additional evidence and identifying other potential criminal activities that might have been connected to the educational fund conspiracy. Her cooperation would extend the federal investigation while ensuring that all aspects of criminal behavior would be thoroughly examined and appropriately prosecuted. Derek Mitchell's attorney recognized that Margaret's cooperation represented a significant threat to his client's defense strategy particularly regarding the RICO charges that required proof of ongoing criminal enterprise involving coordination between multiple participants. Margaret's testimony about planning meetings and coordination activities would provide crucial evidence for establishing the sophisticated criminal organization that justified enhanced racketeering penalties. The formal plea hearing for Margaret Sterling took place before Federal District Judge Catherine Morrison, whose extensive experience with complex financial fraud cases provided valuable perspective on the appropriate balance between punishment and cooperation incentives. Judge Morrison carefully reviewed the terms of the plea agreement, while ensuring that Margaret understood the full scope of her admissions and the consequences of violating cooperation requirements. Margaret's allocution during the plea hearing provided the first public acknowledgement of criminal responsibility for the conspiracy that had stolen Catherine's educational future. Her detailed confession established the timeline of criminal planning, acknowledged the harm inflicted upon Catherine's educational prospects, and accepted personal responsibility for violating federal laws designed to protect educational investments. The emotional impact of Margaret's confession was particularly significant for Catherine, who had maintained some hope that her grandmother's participation in the conspiracy had been limited or coerced, rather than voluntary and deliberate. The detailed admission of criminal planning and coordination provided painful confirmation that the theft of her educational fund had been premeditated and systematic, rather than the result of poor judgment or family pressure. Margaret's cooperation with federal prosecutors began immediately following her plea hearing, as she provided detailed debriefing sessions that revealed additional evidence of criminal planning and coordination that had not been uncovered during the initial investigation. Her testimony provided crucial insights into Harold's leadership role and Derek's manipulation tactics that would strengthen prosecution efforts against the remaining defendants. The cooperation sessions revealed that the conspiracy had extended over a much longer period than originally understood, with planning activities beginning more than 6 months before the actual liquidation of Catherine's educational fund. Margaret's testimony established that Derek had been pressuring family members to provide financial support for his restaurant venture since the failure of his previous business, and that the educational fund had been specifically targeted because of its substantial value and perceived accessibility. Margaret's debriefing also revealed Harold's sophisticated research into federal regulations governing educational savings accounts, including his attempts to identify potential loopholes or procedural weaknesses that could be exploited to access Catherine's fund without triggering federal oversight mechanisms. This evidence of premeditation and sophisticated planning strengthened the criminal charges, while undermining defense arguments about the defendant's understanding of legal consequences. The cooperation agreement required Margaret to provide testimony about Michael's active participation in the conspiracy, including his research into my travel schedule and his coordination of timing for the unauthorized liquidation. Her testimony established that Michael's involvement had been essential for ensuring that the conspiracy could be executed without my knowledge or intervention, contradicting his defense strategy that characterized his role as passive knowledge rather than active participation. Harold Sterling's response to Margaret's cooperation reflected his growing recognition that continued resistance against federal prosecution was becoming untenable. His attorney initiated preliminary discussions about potential plea agreements while attempting to negotiate terms that would minimize his prison exposure in exchange for cooperation against Derek Mitchell, whom prosecutors viewed as the primary beneficiary and instigator of the conspiracy. The negotiations surrounding Harold's potential plea agreement were complicated by his leadership role in executing the unauthorized liquidation and his attempts to obstruct the federal investigation through evidence destruction and asset concealment. Federal prosecutors indicated that any plea agreement would require substantial prison time and complete financial restitution, while cooperation against Derek might influence the specific length of incarceration rather than eliminating imprisonment entirely. Harold's deteriorating health conditions during pretrial detention added urgency to plea negotiations, as prolonged imprisonment could create serious medical complications that would require costly federal medical care, while potentially creating sympathy factors that could influence sentencing decisions. His attorney emphasized these health concerns while arguing that cooperation and restitution should be weighted more heavily than punishment in determining appropriate sentencing outcomes. Michael Sterling's plea negotiations proved increasingly complex, as Margaret's cooperation revealed the extent of his active participation in planning and coordination activities. The evidence provided by Margaret's debriefing sessions contradicted his defense strategy and established clear criminal liability that would be extremely difficult to dispute during trial proceedings. The revelation of Michael's central role in timing and coordination activities created additional complications for our divorce proceedings, as his criminal behavior had violated fiduciary duties related to family financial planning while demonstrating fundamental character deficiencies that would influence custody and financial settlement decisions. His criminal participation in stealing his own daughter's educational fund provided compelling evidence of unfitness for shared custody or significant financial responsibilities. Derek Mitchell's attorney recognized that Margaret's cooperation represented an existential threat to his client's defense strategy, particularly regarding the RICO charges that carried enhanced penalties for ongoing criminal enterprise. The evidence provided through Margaret's cooperation established the coordination and planning necessary to prove racketeering violations, while demonstrating Derek's central role in manipulating family relationships to secure funding for fraudulent business activities. The mounting pressure of Margaret's cooperation and the strengthening federal prosecution led Derek's attorney to explore potential plea agreements that could minimize his exposure to RICO penalties. While acknowledging his central role in instigating the conspiracy, federal prosecutors indicated willingness to consider reduced charges in exchange for complete cooperation and comprehensive financial restitution, but emphasized that substantial prison time would be required for any plea agreement. The cascade of plea negotiations initiated by Margaret's cooperation agreement had fundamentally altered the dynamics of the federal prosecution while ensuring that complete accountability would be achieved for all participants in the conspiracy. The systematic breakdown of defendant unity demonstrated the power of comprehensive federal investigation and strategic prosecution techniques that created irresistible pressure for cooperation and confession. As Margaret's debriefing sessions continued to reveal additional evidence and strengthen prosecution efforts against remaining defendants, I felt profound satisfaction knowing that my strategic decision to pursue federal prosecution rather than family negotiations had created circumstances that would ensure complete justice for Catherine while establishing permanent consequences for those who had betrayed our trust and violated federal laws designed to protect educational investments. Margaret Sterling's comprehensive cooperation with federal prosecutors created an unstoppable momentum that systematically dismantled the remaining defendants' ability to maintain coordinated resistance against the criminal charges. Spacey Ease. Her detailed testimony provided federal prosecutors with insider knowledge of the conspiracy's planning, execution, and attempted concealment that proved impossible for defense attorneys to challenge or discredit during subsequent plea negotiations. The strategic impact of Margaret's cooperation extended beyond simple testimony to encompass documentary evidence that she provided regarding financial planning discussions, coordination meetings, and specific communications between conspirators that had previously been unknown to federal investigators. Her production of handwritten notes, email communications, and financial documents provided corroborating evidence that transformed her testimony from potentially disputed recollections into verifiable factual accounts supported by contemporaneous documentation. Harold Sterling's position became particularly precarious following Margaret's cooperation, as her testimony established his central leadership role in researching federal regulations, developing strategies for unauthorized access to Catherine's educational fund, and coordinating the timing of the liquidation to avoid detection. The evidence provided through Margaret's debriefing sessions contradicted Harold's defense strategy that had attempted to minimize his involvement, while characterizing the conspiracy as Derek's manipulation of well-intentioned family members. The mounting evidence provided by Margaret's cooperation prompted Harold's attorney to accelerate plea negotiations with federal prosecutors, recognizing that continued resistance would likely result in conviction on all charges and maximum sentencing under federal guidelines. The evidence established Harold's criminal liability beyond reasonable doubt, while demonstrating sophisticated planning and premeditation that would justify enhanced penalties if the matter proceeded to trial. Federal prosecutors approached Harold's plea negotiations from a position of overwhelming strength, given Margaret's cooperation and the documentary evidence that established his leadership role in the conspiracy. Assistant United States Attorney Maria Santos outlined terms that required guilty pleas to mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit federal crimes, and money laundering charges that would result in substantial prison time, regardless of cooperation agreements or mitigating factors. The prosecution's position emphasized that Harold's age and health conditions would be considered during sentencing recommendations, but that the serious nature of the crimes and his leadership role in the conspiracy required meaningful incarceration to ensure appropriate deterrence and punishment. The offer included provisions for cooperation against Derek Mitchell and Michael Sterling that could influence the specific length of prison sentences while ensuring that substantial consequences would be imposed. Harold's decision to accept the plea agreement represented a profound acknowledgement that his assumptions about family authority over educational funds had been fundamentally incorrect, and that his actions had constituted serious federal crimes with severe consequences. His cooperation agreement required detailed testimony about Derek's role in instigating the conspiracy and Michael's active participation in planning and coordination activities. The formal plea hearing for Harold Sterling provided additional public acknowledgement of criminal responsibility while establishing the factual foundation for prosecution of the remaining defendants. His allocution before Federal District Judge Catherine Morrison included detailed admissions regarding his research into federal regulations, his development of strategies for unauthorized fund access, and his coordination with other conspirators to execute the theft of Catherine's educational savings. Harold's cooperation with federal prosecutors revealed the extent of Derek's manipulation tactics and his systematic approach to identifying and exploiting potential funding sources for his fraudulent business ventures. The debriefing sessions established that Derek had conducted extensive research into family financial resources and had deliberately targeted Catherine's educational fund because of its substantial value and his perception that family relationships would prevent legal consequences for unauthorized access. The cooperation agreement also required Harold to provide testimony regarding Michael's essential role in coordinating the timing of the unauthorized liquidation and his provision of information about my travel schedule that enabled the conspirators to execute their plan without immediate detection. This testimony contradicted Michael's defense strategy while establishing his active participation in criminal conspiracy rather than passive knowledge of family financial decisions. Michael Sterling's position became increasingly desperate, as both Margaret and Harold's cooperation provided comprehensive evidence of his active participation in planning and executing the conspiracy against his own daughter's educational future. The mounting testimony established that his role had been essential for successful completion of the unauthorized liquidation, while demonstrating deliberate betrayal of parental responsibilities and fiduciary duties. The evidence provided through cooperative witnesses established that Michael had conducted research into the Educational Excellence Trust Fund's structure and regulatory requirements, had coordinated with other conspirators regarding optimal timing for the liquidation, and had actively concealed the conspiracy from me during the planning and execution phases. His participation had been voluntary and sophisticated rather than reluctant compliance with family pressure. Michael's attorney recognized that continued resistance against federal prosecution had become futile, given the comprehensive evidence provided by cooperative witnesses and the documentary materials that corroborated their testimony. The defense strategy shifted towards seeking plea terms that would minimize prison exposure, while acknowledging that substantial consequences would be unavoidable given the serious nature of his criminal behavior. The plea negotiations surrounding Michael's case were complicated by the additional considerations related to our divorce proceedings and custody arrangements that would be affected by his criminal conviction and imprisonment. Federal prosecutors indicated that cooperation agreements could influence sentencing recommendations, but emphasized that meaningful consequences would be required, given his betrayal of parental responsibilities and active participation in stealing his daughter's educational security. Michael's decision to pursue plea negotiations represented acknowledgement that his assumptions about family loyalty and protection from legal consequences had been fundamentally mistaken. His cooperation agreement required detailed testimony about Derek's manipulation tactics and his central role in instigating the conspiracy while providing additional evidence regarding the planning and coordination activities that had enabled the unauthorized liquidation. The formal plea hearing for Michael Sterling proved particularly emotional, given the family relationships involved and the devastating impact of his criminal behavior on Catherine's educational security and our family's stability. His allocution before Federal District Judge Morrison included admissions regarding his research into fund liquidation procedures, his coordination of timing with other conspirators, and his deliberate concealment of criminal activities from family members who would have prevented the unauthorized transaction. Derek Mitchell found himself increasingly isolated, as the cooperation agreements provided by other family members established his central role in instigating and coordinating the conspiracy, while benefiting directly from the theft of Catherine's educational funds. The evidence provided through cooperative witnesses demonstrated that Derek had systematically manipulated family relationships and exploited trust to secure funding for business ventures that he knew were unlikely to succeed. The comprehensive evidence provided by cooperative witnesses established that Derek had conducted extensive research into potential funding sources among extended family members, and had deliberately targeted Catherine's educational fund because of its substantial value and regulatory protections that he assumed could be circumvented through family relationships. His business plan had been deliberately misleading to secure approval for the unauthorized liquidation, while concealing the speculative nature of his restaurant venture. Derek's attorney faced the challenging task of negotiating plea terms for a defendant who had been established as the primary instigator and beneficiary of the conspiracy, while facing enhanced RICO penalties for ongoing criminal enterprise. The evidence provided by cooperative witnesses demonstrated that Derek's fraudulent business practices extended beyond the educational fund conspiracy to encompass a pattern of deceptive activities involving multiple victims and financial institutions. Federal prosecutors approached Derek's plea negotiations from a position of maximum strength, given the comprehensive evidence provided by cooperative witnesses and the documentary materials that established his central role in the conspiracy. The prosecution's position emphasized that Derek's manipulation of family relationships and systematic approach to fraudulent business practices justified substantial prison sentences under enhanced RICO penalties regardless of cooperation agreements. The plea agreement ultimately accepted by Derek Mitchell included guilty pleas to conspiracy to commit federal crimes, mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and RICO violations that would result in substantial prison time and comprehensive financial restitution. The cooperation provisions required detailed testimony about his fraudulent business practices and systematic exploitation of family relationships, while providing information about potential additional victims of his criminal activities. The cascade of plea agreements and cooperation arrangements had achieved comprehensive accountability for all participants in the conspiracy, while ensuring that Catherine's educational fund would be fully restored through court-ordered restitution. The systematic breakdown of defendant resistance demonstrated the power of strategic federal prosecution techniques that created irresistible pressure for acknowledgement of criminal responsibility and cooperation with ongoing law enforcement efforts. The completion of plea negotiations marked a significant milestone in achieving justice for Catherine while establishing permanent consequences for family members who had betrayed trust and violated federal laws designed to protect educational investments. The comprehensive nature of the plea agreements ensured that all aspects of criminal behavior would be appropriately punished, while providing complete financial recovery and restoration of Catherine's educational security. As the formal sentencing hearings approached, I reflected on the profound validation that had resulted from strategic pursuit of federal prosecution rather than family negotiations that would have provided inadequate justice and insufficient protection for Catherine's future educational objectives. The systematic achievement of accountability through proper legal channels had demonstrated that comprehensive documentation and strategic thinking could overcome even sophisticated criminal conspiracies involving trusted family members. The federal sentencing hearings commenced in the solemn atmosphere of Federal District Judge Catherine Morrison's courtroom, where the comprehensive nature of the criminal conspiracy would finally result in appropriate consequences for all participants who had violated federal laws designed to protect educational investments. The formal proceedings represented the culmination of systematic federal prosecution that had transformed family betrayal into comprehensive criminal accountability, through strategic documentation and coordinated law enforcement efforts. Federal sentencing guidelines required careful consideration of multiple factors, including the severity of criminal conduct, the defendant's acceptance of responsibility through cooperation agreements, the financial harm inflicted upon victims, and the broader impact of educational fraud on public confidence in federal assistance programs. Judge Morrison's extensive experience with complex financial fraud cases provided valuable perspective on achieving appropriate balance between punishment and rehabilitation, while ensuring meaningful deterrence against similar criminal activities. Margaret Sterling appeared first for formal sentencing, accompanied by her attorney Sandra Phillips, and supported by character witnesses who testified about her previous community involvement and the circumstances that had led to her participation in the conspiracy. The cooperation agreement had secured supervised release rather than imprisonment, contingent upon complete compliance with restitution requirements and ongoing cooperation with federal authorities in addressing related criminal activities. Judge Morrison acknowledged Margaret's cooperation with federal prosecutors while emphasizing that her voluntary participation in the conspiracy had violated fundamental trust relationships and federal laws designed to protect vulnerable educational investments. The supervised release included substantial community service requirements focused on educational advocacy and financial literacy programs that would address the underlying issues that had contributed to her criminal behavior. The restitution requirements included Margaret's proportionate share of comprehensive financial recovery for Catherine's educational fund, enhanced by penalty assessments that reflected the federal matching grants and tax advantages that had been compromised through the unauthorized liquidation. The financial consequences would ensure that Margaret's retirement security would be permanently affected by her decision to participate in the theft of her granddaughter's educational future. Harold Sterling's sentencing hearing proved more complex due to his leadership role in executing the unauthorized liquidation and his attempts to obstruct the federal investigation through evidence destruction and asset concealment. The cooperation agreement had reduced potential prison exposure, but could not eliminate incarceration entirely, given the serious nature of his criminal conduct and the sophisticated planning that had characterized his participation in the conspiracy. Judge Morrison imposed a sentence of 18 months in federal prison, followed by supervised release and comprehensive restitution requirements that would effectively eliminate Harold's retirement assets and require ongoing financial monitoring to ensure complete compliance with court-ordered payments. The prison sentence reflected the balance between his cooperation with federal prosecutors and the need for meaningful consequences that would deter similar criminal behavior by others. The allocution provided by Harold during his sentencing hearing included acknowledgement of the devastating impact his criminal behavior had inflicted upon Catherine's educational prospects and his profound regret regarding the violation of family trust relationships. His statement emphasized that his assumptions about family authority over educational funds had been fundamentally incorrect, and that his actions had constituted serious federal crimes deserving significant consequences. Michael Sterling's sentencing hearing represented the most emotionally complex proceeding given the family relationships involved and the profound betrayal of parental responsibilities that his criminal behavior had encompassed. The cooperation agreement had provided some mitigation of potential sentences, but federal guidelines required substantial consequences for his active participation in stealing his own daughter's educational security. Judge Morrison imposed a sentence of 36 months in federal prison, followed by supervised release and comprehensive restitution requirements that would permanently affect his professional licensing and career prospects. The sentence reflected the particularly egregious nature of his criminal conduct, which had violated fundamental parental duties while demonstrating sophisticated planning and deliberate betrayal of family trust relationships. The professional consequences extended beyond criminal sanctions to encompass permanent revocation of his real estate license and prohibition from engaging in fiduciary relationships that could provide opportunities for similar violations of trust. The licensing consequences would ensure that his criminal behavior would result in permanent career consequences that extended far beyond the immediate prison sentence and financial restitution requirements. Derek Mitchell's sentencing hearing addressed the most serious criminal charges given his central role in instigating the conspiracy and his pattern of fraudulent business practices that had culminated in the theft of Catherine's educational funds. The RICO charges and evidence of ongoing criminal enterprise justified enhanced penalties under federal sentencing guidelines that reflected the systematic nature of his criminal activities. Judge Morrison imposed a sentence of 7 years in federal prison, followed by supervised release and comprehensive restitution requirements that would effectively eliminate his business assets and require ongoing monitoring to prevent similar criminal activities. The enhanced sentence reflected the particularly serious nature of RICO violations and the systematic exploitation of family relationships to support fraudulent business ventures. The restitution requirements included comprehensive financial recovery for Catherine's educational fund, enhanced by punitive damages that reflected the federal matching grants, tax advantages, and future educational opportunities that had been compromised through Derek's manipulation of family relationships. The financial consequences would ensure that his fraudulent business practices would result in permanent economic consequences that extended far beyond the immediate criminal penalties. The comprehensive nature of the sentencing proceedings had achieved complete accountability for all participants in the conspiracy, while ensuring full restoration of Catherine's educational security through court-ordered restitution and asset forfeiture. The systematic imposition of meaningful consequences demonstrated the effectiveness of strategic federal prosecution in addressing complex criminal conspiracies involving family relationships and sophisticated planning. The civil litigation that had proceeded parallel to criminal prosecution achieved comprehensive financial recovery that exceeded the original value of Catherine's educational fund through punitive damages, penalty assessments, and compensation for lost federal benefits and tax advantages. The civil remedies ensured that Catherine's educational objectives would be fully supported while providing additional consequences for the defendants' criminal behavior. Pacific Northwest Federal Credit Union had agreed to substantial settlement terms that included comprehensive policy reforms, employee training programs, and financial contributions to Catherine's restored educational fund. The institutional settlement ensured that proper verification procedures would be implemented to prevent similar violations while providing additional resources for Catherine's educational security. The federal prosecution had also initiated broader policy reforms within the Advanced Educational Investment Program that strengthened fraud detection mechanisms, enhanced verification procedures, and improved coordination between oversight agencies to prevent similar violations. Catherine's case had contributed to systemic improvements that would protect future educational investments while maintaining confidence in federal assistance programs. The completion of criminal sentencing and civil litigation provided comprehensive closure for the devastating family betrayal, while ensuring that Catherine's educational future would be fully secured through restored funding and enhanced protections. The systematic achievement of justice through proper legal channels had demonstrated that strategic documentation and federal prosecution could overcome even sophisticated criminal conspiracies involving trusted family members. Catherine's response to the final resolution reflected both satisfaction that appropriate justice had been achieved and sadness regarding the permanent destruction of family relationships that had resulted from criminal behavior by people she had trusted and loved. Her resilience and maturity in processing these complex circumstances had strengthened throughout the legal proceedings, while her academic performance had remained excellent despite the emotional challenges associated with family criminal prosecution. The restoration of Catherine's educational fund through comprehensive restitution and civil recovery had actually enhanced her educational prospects beyond the original funding level, through punitive damages and penalty assessments that provided additional security for her academic objectives. The systematic pursuit of justice had transformed devastating family betrayal into enhanced educational opportunities while establishing permanent consequences for those who had violated trust and federal law. The broader impact of the federal prosecution extended beyond immediate family consequences to encompass deterrence effects that would protect other families from similar violations while strengthening public confidence in federal educational assistance programs. The comprehensive nature of criminal penalties and civil remedies demonstrated that violations of educational funding programs would result in serious consequences, regardless of family relationships or sophisticated planning efforts. As the formal legal proceedings concluded and Catherine prepared for her senior year of high school with restored educational security, I reflected on the profound validation that had resulted from strategic pursuit of comprehensive justice through proper legal channels. The systematic documentation and federal prosecution had achieved outcomes that exceeded my most optimistic expectations, while establishing permanent accountability for criminal behavior that had threatened to destroy my daughter's educational future. The months following the completion of criminal sentencing and comprehensive civil litigation marked a profound period of reconstruction and transformation that extended far beyond the immediate restoration of Catherine's educational security. The systematic pursuit of justice through federal prosecution had created ripple effects throughout regulatory agencies, financial institutions, and educational policy frameworks that would provide enhanced protection for future families, while establishing Catherine and me as inadvertent advocates for educational funding reform. The Department of Education's comprehensive review of the Advanced Educational Investment Program had identified multiple systematic vulnerabilities that had enabled the unauthorized liquidation of Catherine's fund, despite federal oversight mechanisms designed to prevent such violations. The regulatory analysis revealed that existing verification procedures had been inadequate for sophisticated fraud schemes that exploited family relationships and institutional trust to circumvent standard protection protocols. Assistant Secretary of Education Dr. Michael Rodriguez initiated comprehensive reform measures that address the specific weaknesses identified through Catherine's case while strengthening overall program integrity for all participating families. The reforms included enhanced identity verification requirements, mandatory multi-factor authentication for account access, and improved coordination between federal oversight agencies that monitored educational savings accounts for suspicious activity. The new verification protocols required multiple forms of authentication, including biometric identification, encrypted digital signatures, and real-time communication with account administrators before any substantial transactions could be processed. These enhanced security measures would prevent future incidents of unauthorized access while maintaining appropriate flexibility for legitimate educational fund management by designated administrators. The Federal Banking Commission had also initiated comprehensive review of institutional compliance procedures at financial institutions that administered federally regulated educational savings accounts. The investigation revealed that Pacific Northwest Federal Credit Union's failure to follow proper verification procedures represented broader systemic issues affecting multiple institutions that processed educational fund transactions without adequate oversight or employee training. Commissioner Sarah Chen announced mandatory compliance reforms that required enhanced employee training programs, improved verification technology, and regular auditing procedures to ensure that financial institutions maintained appropriate safeguards for federally protected educational investments. The reforms included substantial penalties for institutional failures that enabled unauthorized access to educational funds while providing clear protocols for reporting suspicious activities to federal authorities. The enhanced institutional requirements created comprehensive accountability frameworks that extended responsibility for educational fund protection beyond individual account holders to encompass the financial institutions and regulatory agencies that administered federal programs. The systematic reforms would prevent future violations while ensuring that institutional failures would result in appropriate consequences for organizations that failed to maintain adequate protection protocols. Catherine's response to the enhanced educational funding protections reflected both satisfaction that her experience had contributed to meaningful policy improvements and determination to advocate for continued strengthening of educational security measures. Her academic performance had remained exceptional throughout the legal proceedings, and her college preparation activities had intensified as her restored educational fund provided enhanced opportunities for pursuing competitive university programs. The restoration of Catherine's educational fund through comprehensive restitution and civil recovery had actually exceeded the original funding level through punitive damages, penalty assessments, and compensation for lost federal benefits. The enhanced funding provided additional security for her educational objectives, while offering opportunities for advanced academic programs and research experiences that had not been financially feasible under the original fund structure. Catherine's college application strategy had evolved to encompass highly competitive university programs that specialized in environmental engineering and policy development, reflecting her growing interest in addressing systematic challenges that affected vulnerable populations. Her personal statement essays addressed the experience of educational fund theft and recovery, while emphasizing her commitment to developing solutions that would protect future families from similar violations. The admissions committees at multiple prestigious universities had responded positively to Catherine's unique perspective on educational security and policy development, recognizing that her experience provided valuable insights into the intersection of legal advocacy, regulatory compliance, and educational access. Her academic credentials, combined with personal experience of systematic reform advocacy, had created compelling applications that exceeded admission requirements at her preferred institutions. My own professional development had been transformed through the experience of pursuing comprehensive federal prosecution while managing complex regulatory compliance issues that extended beyond my previous expertise areas. The systematic documentation and strategic coordination required for successful criminal prosecution had enhanced my understanding of federal law enforcement procedures while expanding my professional network to include specialized attorneys and policy advocates throughout the educational funding sector. The recognition that I had received through successful prosecution of the educational fund conspiracy had generated multiple consulting opportunities with families facing similar violations and attorneys seeking expertise in educational funding compliance. The consulting work provided additional income while enabling me to assist other families in achieving justice for educational fund violations that might otherwise have been inadequately addressed through limited legal representation. The American Bar Association had invited me to present educational seminars about regulatory compliance and family financial protection that addressed the legal frameworks governing educational savings accounts and the procedures for seeking federal prosecution when violations occurred. The speaking opportunities provided platforms for sharing expertise while advocating for continued strengthening of educational fund protection measures. The National Association of Educational Fund Administrators had requested my participation in policy development committees that addressed systematic improvements to federal oversight procedures and institutional compliance requirements. The committee work enabled me to contribute directly to regulatory reform efforts, while ensuring that Catherine's experience would inform broader policy improvements that protected future educational investments. The Family Financial Protection Alliance had appointed me to their advisory board, recognizing that my expertise in regulatory compliance and successful prosecution of family financial crimes provided valuable perspective on developing comprehensive protection strategies for vulnerable family financial assets. The advisory role enabled me to influence policy development while building relationships with other advocates who shared commitments to protecting family educational security. The media attention surrounding Catherine's case had generated opportunities for public education about educational fund protection and the importance of systematic documentation in achieving justice when violations occurred. The interviews and articles provided platforms for raising awareness about federal protection mechanisms while encouraging other families to pursue comprehensive legal remedies when educational investments were threatened or compromised. The documentary film project initiated by Educational Advocacy Productions had begun comprehensive filming that would chronicle Catherine's experience from the initial discovery of fund liquidation through the successful prosecution and policy reform impacts. The documentary would provide educational resources for families while demonstrating the effectiveness of systematic legal advocacy in achieving justice for complex financial crimes. The broader impact of Catherine's case had influenced federal policy discussions about comprehensive reform of educational funding programs that addressed both fraud prevention and victim recovery procedures. Congressional hearings had examined the systematic issues revealed through our case while exploring legislative solutions that would strengthen protection for educational investments throughout the federal assistance framework. Senator Patricia Williams had introduced comprehensive legislation that would enhance federal oversight of educational savings programs while providing streamlined procedures for victims of educational fund theft to achieve rapid recovery and criminal prosecution. The proposed legislation incorporated lessons learned from Catherine's case while addressing broader systematic issues that affected educational funding security throughout the federal programs. The legislative proposal included enhanced criminal penalties for educational fund theft, improved coordination between federal oversight agencies, and mandatory institutional compliance requirements that would prevent the types of violations that had enabled the theft of Catherine's educational security. The comprehensive approach reflected recognition that systematic reform was necessary to address the vulnerabilities revealed through our experience. The ongoing policy development efforts had positioned Catherine and me as influential advocates for educational funding reform while providing opportunities to shape regulatory improvements that would protect future families from similar violations. The transformation from victims of educational fund theft to recognized policy advocates demonstrated the potential for individual experiences of injustice to generate systematic improvements that benefited broader communities. As Catherine completed her senior year of high school with restored educational security and enhanced opportunities for pursuing competitive university programs, I reflected on the profound transformation that had resulted from strategic pursuit of comprehensive justice through proper legal channels. The systematic documentation and federal prosecution had achieved outcomes that exceeded expectations, while establishing permanent improvements to educational funding protection that would benefit countless future families. Catherine's acceptance to Stanford University's environmental engineering program represented the culmination of academic excellence that had persevered through extraordinary challenges, while establishing the foundation for advanced research and policy development that would extend her impact far beyond personal educational achievement. The comprehensive restoration of her educational fund through federal prosecution and civil litigation had provided enhanced opportunities for pursuing specialized academic programs and research initiatives that addressed systematic environmental challenges affecting vulnerable communities worldwide. The admissions committee at Stanford had recognized Catherine's unique perspective on regulatory compliance and systematic reform advocacy as valuable assets that would contribute meaningfully to their interdisciplinary research programs. Her personal statement had demonstrated exceptional maturity in processing complex legal and ethical challenges, while maintaining unwavering commitment to academic excellence and community service that aligned perfectly with Stanford's institutional values and research objectives. Professor Dr. Elizabeth Chen, director of Stanford's Environmental Policy Research Institute, had personally recruited Catherine for advanced research opportunities that combined technical engineering expertise with policy development and regulatory analysis. The Research Institute specialized in developing innovative solutions to environmental challenges while working directly with government agencies and international organizations to implement systematic reforms that protected natural resources and public health. Catherine's research focus centered on developing technological solutions for environmental contamination remediation that incorporated comprehensive regulatory compliance frameworks designed to prevent future violations and ensure sustainable implementation. Her undergraduate thesis project examined the intersection of environmental engineering and federal oversight mechanisms while proposing enhanced monitoring systems that would detect violations before significant environmental damage occurred. The research methodologies that Catherine developed incorporated lessons learned from her family's experience with federal regulatory enforcement, while applying systematic documentation and evidence-gathering techniques to environmental compliance monitoring. Her approach demonstrated how principles of regulatory advocacy could be effectively applied to environmental protection efforts, while ensuring that violations would result in appropriate consequences for responsible parties. The Environmental Policy Research Institute had secured federal funding for Catherine's research through grants from the Environmental Protection Agency and the National Science Foundation that recognized the innovative potential of her interdisciplinary approach to environmental protection and regulatory enforcement. The federal funding provided resources for advanced equipment, field research, and collaboration with government agencies that were implementing environmental protection programs throughout the United States. Catherine's academic performance at Stanford exceeded expectations established by her exceptional high school record, while demonstrating continued growth in research capabilities and policy development expertise. Her coursework included advanced engineering studies, environmental law and policy analysis, and regulatory compliance procedures that provided comprehensive foundation for addressing complex environmental challenges through systematic technical and legal approaches. The undergraduate research opportunities at Stanford enabled Catherine to work directly with graduate students and faculty researchers who were developing cutting-edge environmental remediation technologies while collaborating with federal agencies to implement regulatory reforms. The research experience provided practical application of theoretical knowledge while building professional relationships that would support her advanced academic and career objectives. My consulting practice had expanded significantly following the successful resolution of Catherine's case, as families throughout the United States sought expertise in educational funding protection and regulatory compliance advocacy. The consulting work required careful balance between professional obligations and continued support for Catherine's academic development, while maintaining focus on policy advocacy that would strengthen educational funding protection for future families. The complexity of educational funding violations that clients presented required comprehensive understanding of federal regulations, state compliance requirements, and institutional procedures that governed various types of educational savings and investment programs. Each case demanded systematic analysis of specific circumstances while developing strategic approaches that maximized opportunities for recovery and accountability through appropriate legal channels. The American Educational Fund Protection Association had appointed me as their National Advocacy Director, recognizing that my expertise in regulatory compliance and successful prosecution of educational funding violations provided valuable leadership for developing comprehensive protection strategies nationwide. The position required coordination with federal agencies, state regulatory authorities, and educational institutions to implement systematic reforms that prevented unauthorized access to educational investments. The advocacy work included development of model legislation that states could adopt to strengthen protection for educational savings programs, while providing streamlined procedures for victims of educational fund theft to achieve rapid recovery and criminal prosecution. The legislative proposals incorporated lessons learned from Catherine's case, while addressing broader systematic issues that affected educational funding security throughout various state and federal programs. The National Conference of Educational Fund Administrators had requested my participation in developing comprehensive training programs for financial institution employees who processed educational fund transactions. The training curricula addressed proper verification procedures, fraud detection techniques, and reporting protocols that would prevent institutional failures that enabled unauthorized access to protected educational investments. The training programs included case study analysis that examined actual violations and successful prosecution efforts, while providing practical guidance for institutional employees who needed to understand both their legal obligations and the procedures for reporting suspicious activities to appropriate authorities. The educational approach ensured that institutional personnel would possess necessary expertise to maintain adequate protection for educational investments. Catherine's involvement in policy advocacy had expanded through her participation in student research organizations at Stanford that focused on environmental policy development and regulatory reform. Her unique perspective on federal prosecution and systematic reform advocacy provided valuable insights for student research projects that addressed various regulatory challenges affecting environmental protection and public policy implementation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.